The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in to this webinar, which is on dignity at work. It's certainly got a lot of interest, that's for sure. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. So just over in the question box over on the right-hand side, could I ask you please just to type in the word clear? That lets me at least know that I'm being heard and not speaking to myself. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Doreen. Thanks, Kim. Sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is great. Wonderful. Now, look, if you've got questions, and you probably will have, or want to make comments or observations, then that's the place to do it. Just go to the question box and just type in your question. And what I will do is I will deal with it right there and then at the time. So I won't wait until the end, because then we kind of have this awkward pause while people are thinking about what they're going to ask or what they're going to say. So as soon as you've got a statement or a comment that you want to make, then I suggest you just type it straight in and away we go. All right, so you can see on the screen here my latest book, which I'm very proud of the cover. I don't know what you think, but I was really happy with the way Palgrave Macmillan designed the cover. And the book, Bringing the Human Being Back to Work, the 10 Performance and Development Conversations Leaders Must Have. One of the chapters, of course, is actually on dignity at work and the whole concept of having dignity at work. So it prompted me to think, well, I'll put it out there as a free webinar. So let's launch into the presentation. Now, there's essentially three things that I'd like to get out of today's session, and I hope that they resonate with you. I'd like to talk a little bit about what, in my view, workplace dignity really means, so a bit of a definition and how I would position it, and what some of the threats are around that. I'm sure you could already guess what some of those threats are, and I'm sure you've probably even witnessed those threats, or perhaps even regrettably be on the receiving end of those threats and barriers. And then I want to talk about communication, because at the end of the day, communication is the critical link between dignity and dignity in the workplace. So the solutions are all based on conversations and communication strategies. All right, so that's what we're covering in this brief presentation. I should also point out to you, because you are involved today, you'll receive a copy of the slides, and you'll also receive a copy of the video as well. So you'll get a chance to download that from YouTube if you want to review it. So just relax. You don't need to take notes, and just have a think about some of the concepts that I'm raising with you today. Now, I think it's quite interesting that we have been terrified of, or are terrified at the moment, about artificial intelligence taking our jobs. I mean, it doesn't matter what magazine or what blog you look at, this is a very topical conversation. And so we're very worried about automation and AI taking over our jobs. But what's quite interesting about this is that for, well, at least 100 years, we've all been taught to be robotic at work. So, you get these kind of sayings like, leave your problems at home, toughen up, princess, separate your home life from your work life, and so on and so forth. So we've heard all these sayings in the workplace, and what those sayings are really about is to attempt to make us more automated, I guess, as human beings. So it's quite ironic, isn't it, now that we're very worried about becoming or automation replacing our jobs, that we have in fact become quite automated in the way we do things. You think about the KPIs, think about the targets, think about the way our work has been very much systemized and homogenized so that people can just lock into a process and not have to really bring their brains to work. And in fact, one of the chapters in my book is called The Dumbing Down of Work. So I think this is very real. So I just think it's quite ironic that um, we have our humanness, in fact, could be the impediment or could be our saviour at the end. And of course, most of the surveys show that being creative and communicative and all of those kind of skills are really the things that will be in great demand in the future. So here's a definition which will come up on your screen very shortly. Here we go. There it is. The definition is a definition of what I would define as workplace dignity. So this is my definition, but you can probably gain your own. But let's just be clear about what we're talking about here. But in my view, workplace dignity is a personal sense of worth, of value, respect, or esteem that is derived from one's humanity and individual social position, as well as being treated respectfully by others. So the key words there, of course, are the ones that I've highlighted. Now, respect at work, I think, is in short supply. If you think about the number of allegations of bullying and harassment and all the rest of it in the workplace, it doesn't seem to be going away. In fact, if anything, it seems to be increasing. I'm not sure whether it is increasing or not, but it's certainly not diminishing. And I think this is problematic because obviously a lot of this is undignified, and because of that, you can hardly say that our workplaces are filled with dignity. So let's work from the premise of that definition and consider workplace dignity based on that definition. Now, I put this model together because, in my view, when we talk about some of these programs that we've got under the umbrella, and I mean, some of you I know are intimately involved in some of these programs, and I'm not diminishing them at all. In fact, I'm saying that they're extremely important. But what happens is when we mention these programs, people kind of groan or the eyes roll and they sort of go, here we go again. In other words, it's kind of lost its punch. So, access and equity, or when we select people for jobs, merit-based selection or equal opportunity, or health, wellness and safety, anti-discrimination, conscious or unconscious bias. Look, there's probably other programs under this umbrella as well. But I would argue that all of these programs, ultimately, what's the aim of all of these programs? Well, the aim of all of these programs is ultimately about dignity, isn't it? It's about treating people with dignity. And I think one of the things that I would suggest that you might like to consider is that when you're promoting these sorts of programs in your workplace, instead of going straight for what they are, why don't you take a step back and put them under the umbrella of workplace dignity so that you can create really a why. And this is the why. This is the why we do these things. So I would see workplace dignity as the overarching umbrella, and underneath that you've got a whole bunch and series of different programs that operate in the workplace. So that's the way I'd probably conceptualize workplace dignity and some of its dimensions in the workplace. Okay, now conversations, in my view, form the foundation for what I refer to in my book as the authentic workplace. And without conversations, and these aren't dehydrated conversations, which is a nice term put together by Linda Grattan when she was talking about conversations herself. We're not talking about dehydrated conversations. We're talking about meaningful conversations around performance and development. Conversations hold the linchpin to dignity in the workplace, in my view. Because if you show me a workplace which is devoid of conversations, the sort of conversations that I'm referring to, then it's probably likely that there's going to be behaviours which are undignified. So conversations, in my view, hold the key. But of course, in our technological world, instead of having a face-to-face, a good old-fashioned face-to-face conversation, what we tend to do is to send an email or a text or something like that, or we say nothing. And of course, in our open office environments, people feel reluctant to raise things because they know that there are probably 10 or 12 sets of ears listening in at the same time. So I think, it creates a problem when we're not having decent conversations in the workplace. And I'm not talking about chit chat. I'm talking about really authentic, meaningful conversations with people. And I'm going to share with you 10 of those conversations this morning. All right. Now, I would say to you that one of the things I did cover in this book is I would say to you that there are lots of pressures in the world of work right now, and I believe in the future, that lead to what I would call a human disconnect. So I think human beings are being disconnected in the workplace, and I'm not talking about technological disconnection. I'm talking about interpersonal disconnection. And the workplace I see as a saviour here because it can create a vital community for interaction and support if it's done correctly. So in other words, the workplace has enormous potential to fill a void that occurs in the world which is ultimately disconnected. It's quite interesting that we can connect with anyone in the world, anywhere, anytime, virtually, as long as there's an internet connection, but yet we often don't know who our neighbours are, or we don't know who the person is down the road who serves us our milk. We don't know necessarily who these people are, but we can connect with people. So it's another interesting paradox, isn't it, in the world that we live in. So the workplace, I think, ultimately has a great opportunity to be able to fill this void. We have a great feeling of alienation in the world. There's a lot of loneliness, obviously, in the world. There are a lot of people who more people now are living on their own than ever before. I thought I saw some statistics to say something like 30%. There's a human disconnectivity. In other words, we don't really know, as I said, who our neighbours are. We tend to keep to ourselves. And because of those first two issues there, then the workplace can, and in some ways does, fill the void of community. The community is breaking down. We don't tend to have the same zest towards community service organisations. Church membership is dropping. There's a whole range of different factors that are going on. So the workplace becomes the de facto community, if you like. The other interesting thing is that we're exposed now to more ideas, and you only have to consider meditation and mindfulness, which of course are very topical at the moment. And of course, meditation and mindfulness has been around for a long, long time, but we Westerners are just starting to understand and apply it. And so with an exposure of new ideas and exchanging of new ideas, we can become very curious about other people and the way we do things. And what it does is it creates a philosophy about, wanting to do something meaningful with our lives. And, the other notion that's been going on for a period of time is that we have been calling people human resources. And of course, that's about as undignified as you can get. Consider that we human beings are human resources. We're people, not human resources. And I think most human resources departments are starting to wake up to that now and calling themselves anything but human resources. So I think we've done a lot of things out there to create this disconnect. And I think the workplace has great potential to be able to address many of these things. In fact, I would even argue that it's a competitive advantage that if an organisation can create an organisation that's inclusive and demonstrates dignity and people are given an opportunity to blossom regardless of their beliefs or whatever, then that in itself can be a competitive advantage in this day and age, I believe. So if you've got any questions or comments, I'm more than happy to hear them. Just type them in over on the question box there and I will certainly respond to those if I can. Now, the other concept about this is that since most of us spend roughly a third of our adult life in the workplace, I think it's fair and reasonable to expect and experience workplace dignity, don't you? So I think there's a compelling case for this. for the whole notion of workplace dignity for the very fact that we spend a large chunk of our livelihoods in the workplace, most of us. So I think we should be certainly doing everything we can to talk about this as a notion and an idea. And the good news about this is that you're not likely to get people disagreeing with this. It's a question, of course, of how it's opened up and discussed and promoted in the workplace. Now, the way I see it, there are a number of threats. In fact, I've identified 4 threats to dignity in the workplace, and the number one threat, in my view, is what I call the master-servant mindset. Now, the master-servant mindset, of course, has been around since the year dot, but there are still a lot of managers who believe that they're the master and, the employee is the servant. They still have this mindset. And of course, if you have a master-servant mindset, then it's likely that you're going to treat people who you consider to be servants with contempt. So the whole notion of the employment relationship itself is one of the biggest detractors from dignity in the work. Of course, the employment relationship has been changing profoundly over the last 30 years from a them and us mindset to more of a collaborative way of thinking. But there are still a lot of managers out there that still think that it's all about them and that they have an entitlement and that they can boss people around. So obviously that becomes a critically important impediment to dignity. And this is not so much what they do, it's more around what they think. And as a result of what they think, they act accordingly. Another form of indignity in the workplace is overwork as a form of indignity, particularly when it occurs with managerial support. Now, all of us are stretched in the workplace, and it's true to say that there is a time when all of us would spend more time than perhaps we'd like in the workplace doing work-related matters because the pressures are brought to bear to do that. But if that's being abused, and particularly with managerial support, then I would argue that that's a problem in terms of dignity. So overwork, in my view, could be a threat to treating people in the workplace with dignity. Another threat, a third threat, could be a manager abusing their power and authority is another form, a common stimulus for indignity. So using idle threats and practicing intimidation is humiliating to the recipient, for instance. Now, as I said earlier, this is still going on, and of course, people are now calling this behaviour out and perhaps have always done it, but certainly feel perhaps a little bit more comfortable doing that in this day and age, which is the good news, but that unfortunately hasn't stopped it happening and it still continues. And I think part of the reason that that continues is still this master-servant mindset that we have in the workplace. And another form of indignity that is the form of indignity that comes from being micromanaged. So this is smothering someone's autonomy in the workplace. That can be a form of humiliation to the employee now, particularly in the knowledge worker field where people are qualified and have got a certain knowledge skill set, and they come to work, and if they're being micromanaged by somebody, I would argue that that's a form of indignity. So you can see that it's fairly wide-ranging, and I guess the question we've got to ask is, if those are the 4 forms or threats to indignity, what might be the solution? I don't doubt for a minute there are other forms of threats to dignity in the workplace, but there are 4 that are quite pervasive, we're all familiar with, and we can see them, unfortunately, day to day. So I would suggest to you that workplace dignity is closely related to the quality of interaction and the patterns of communication between the manager and team member. At the end of the day, it's the way managers and their team members engage, as in communicate, that I think holds the linchpin for whether or not we, in fact, do see dignity in the workplace. So therefore, as I said earlier on, I think conversation is critically important, the right sort of conversation between a manager and his or her team member. So the question is, what do those sort of conversations look like, and how might they be promoted? Some of you who would have been in previous webinars of mine would have seen my 5 conversations framework, and this is just one of many frameworks out there that you can use. But I have been promoting the idea that leaders in the workplace should be having regular, you call them catch-ups if you like, with their team members to discuss developmental issues, not appraising performance, but rather developing performance. And so you can see there on your screen that you've got 5 months over on the left-hand side, and you've got 5 topics: climate review, strengths and talents, opportunities for growth, learning and development, and innovation and continuous improvement. So each month it's designed that the manager will have a 10-minute conversation with their particular charges around the themes of those conversations. And really it's about connecting, it's showing dignity, it's showing concern, it's helping that particular individual develop themselves. So that you could do a lot worse than to take on board the 5 conversations framework and implement it in your workplace. And if you need some support on that, come back to me and I can assist you, because there are a range of interventions that we can give you that will help you with that. So that is one way or one framework. And you might say, well, why do we need a framework? Why couldn't we just have these conversations? Well, you and I both know if it was that simple, then the conversations would be just happening. But what happens, of course, is busyness gets in the way, and then we forget. So what happens is that we don't have these conversations, and so we have what I referred to earlier as dehydrated conversations, which mean nothing. And of course, without any meaningful developmental or performance conversations in the workplace, what happens, of course, is that the dignity starts to go out the door, and we start seeing the sort of behaviours that I mentioned earlier. So there's 5. Here's another 5 that you might like to consider. And I'll just run through each of these 5 and then we're done. But another conversation that should be happening in the workplace is the coaching conversation. There is a lot of work out there now in universities and training courses that talk about the leader as the coach. And I think it's a very good approach. But a coach implies that, you've got some expert telling people what to do. So it gets back to that master-servant relationship again. So I would argue that coaching is actually a conversation with 2 people involved. And you can see on your screen there's the GROW model, G-R-O-W. GROW is one of the different methodologies around coaching, which engages the employee in that approach. And I believe my next webinar is on using the GROW model, so you might like to tune into that next month. Another conversation that can promote dignity in the workplace is the mentoring conversation, which is a little different from the coaching conversation. This is where somebody's had a good rounded experience in the world and perhaps can use and share that experience with somebody who may not have had that experience. And so it can be very, very useful, and you can see some of the things on your screen there that can be promoted. So, in a mentoring conversation, a good mentor does a fair bit of listening. A good mentor can be a sounding board. A good mentor can be a role model. So all of these things, in a way, promote dignity. So, and any of you who have had a good mentor in your career would know the great value of having a mentor. And of course, there's nothing more rewarding than being a mentor as well. And I actively promote opportunities for me to be a mentor every year because I get an enormous amount out of it as well. So that's another conversation that adds dignity to the workplace as such. Of course, a lot of people would argue that delegation's not really a conversation, but look, I would suggest to you that it is. I would suggest to you on more complex matters where you are delegating to somebody else, which is giving them a degree of autonomy to make their own decisions and not micromanaging them. I think delegation is, in fact, a conversation between two people. And it's about giving people an opportunity to discuss with you, if you're the leader, some ways and means of going about achieving a particular target or goal. And of course, a lot of managers still struggle with the whole notion of delegation. And I think delegation is a form of dignity in the sense that if it's done correctly, it's empowering. I don't really like that word. Perhaps enabling is a better word. It's enabling to the other person to give them an opportunity to express their own autonomy in the workplace. So I would see that as another form of conversation. This is a great book, and of course Simon Sinek as well talks about the why of work, and I don't think leaders spend enough time explaining to people the why. And what I mean by the why is, why am I asking you to do this? Why do I want you to do such and such? So if we don't give people a big picture, a bigger vision about what we want them to achieve, then they won't be able to put in the task that they've been given into context. And I think this is really important, and it again goes to the heart of dignity, that we give people an understanding of how that role and how that job actually contributes to a bigger vision or what have you. And I think there's two reasons that leaders don't do this. I think one is they make the assumption that the team member already knows what the big picture is, which is a mistake. And secondly, because it takes them time and effort, they probably feel that they'll bypass that and just simply not have a visioning conversation. So I think that's a really important conversation, which is adding dignity. Another conversation that certainly doesn't go on enough is what I would call the encouraging conversation. And in my book that I co-wrote with Aubrey Warren, I make this statement that the key to bringing out the best in others is to express appreciation, acknowledge contribution, and celebrate achievements. To me, that's critically important, and I don't think leaders do enough of this. And it only takes a few minutes. It doesn't take a lot of effort at all, and I can assure you it makes a big difference. I don't think I'm preaching to anyone that wouldn't recognise that in their own workplace. And I mean doing it genuinely. And just because you and I are bulletproof and 10 foot tall and have got to our position and station in life without encouragement doesn't necessarily mean that other people don't necessarily need that encouragement. So I strongly urge you to consider giving encouragement to other people and doing it on a regular basis. So that's another conversation that I think is critically important. Which pretty much brings us to the end of the presentation this morning. So if you've got any questions, now's the time, or statements, I'm more than happy to deal with that right now. Folks, while you're thinking about that, you might like to register for a copy, an advanced copy of my new book. I can't give you a date when it comes out. All I know is it'll be out in the next few months. So what I suggest you do is, if you send me an email, I'll make sure I put you on the list, and then as soon as they're hot off the press, I can notify you, and if you so wish, you can purchase a copy at that stage. So I'm just giving you notice of that, and you'll be some people that will get the very first copies if you do that. I've just got a question here. Tim, why do you think our leaders do not have these authentic conversations? Are they unskilled, unknowing, or other? Brilliant question, Helen. I've been grappling with that question there for quite some time myself. Look, I think I don't. You would imagine that these people as parents would have authentic conversations with their children and their partner and so forth. So it's not as if people can't do it. So I'm not sure it's necessarily a skill issue. I think people are, it comes back to this notion that we've been hoodwinked into being robotic at work, and we've been hoodwinked into being obsessed with KPIs and targets and all sorts of things, that sometimes we forget what we're there for. And at the end of the day, um, any organisation is just a bunch of human beings who get together to achieve a common cause. And I think a lot of leaders have forgotten that notion, and I think that's the reason why. And I guess my quest in life is to remind people that their role is actually to remember that they're actually in charge of human beings, not human resources. I think that's the reason, Helen. I may well be wrong in that, but others may have a different view. But that's what I think, at least. All right. So thank you for that question. Um, so you can contact me if you would like an advanced copy of the book. And finally, just I have a Lunch and Learn series coming up. A Lunch and Learn series is really an opportunity where I broadcast to you 6 one-hour sessions, and you can see what they are on your screen there on the left-hand side for a very reasonable price. And you could do this over lunch. Usually we run them on a Friday, and it's a great opportunity for you or your team to invest in some leadership training based on some of my philosophies that I've shared with you today. So if you're interested, send me an email and I would be more than happy to send you a brochure which will have the costs and what you get and a little bit more detail about what these units entail. So just a quick plug on that if you're interested. So folks, that's pretty much it today. Doesn't look like, sorry, we've got one more question. Oh, sorry, Helen's just saying, thank you, Tim. If you could advise us of one thing we could do to influence this change in our workplaces, what would it be? I think, Helen, why not share the concept of workplace dignity in your team meetings? Why not actually have a conversation in your teams about the concept of workplace dignity using that umbrella slide that I shared with you earlier, and just talk about that? And I think, the more people have conversations about the notion of workplace dignity, the more likely it is that we're going to see authenticity in the workplace. So rejig the balance, if you like, I think would be a good thing. Okay. Thank you for the feedback. That's awesome. Thank you, Regan, I think it is. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. So that's it. So all the best. I wish you a really great weekend, and be in contact if you'd like to know more about the two things that I shared with you today. Thanks, guys, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you, and goodbye.